Hey, Data Team Summit. I'm Abe Gong. I'm really excited to be here, presenting on building a shared foundation of trust through data storytelling. And as happens with these things a lot of the time, I got in and realized, even though wrote that title, I kind of hate it. So I'm just going to make a last minute switch. And instead of that, I'm calling this talk, Don't Turn Your Back on Your Audience. Here's a little bit about me. I'm a technical co-founder at Great Expectations. I've been doing data science, data analytics, and data engineering, kind of a mix of all those, for almost 10 years prior to founding the company. I love getting my hands dirty with data. I love understanding how data affects culture and how culture affects data, and building teams that can make really effective use of that. So that's a little bit about me. Let's dive in on our specific topic here. So have you had this experience? And credit in advance to ChatGPT here. You're working on a data team. You're building something. So whether that's a pipeline or a dashboard, or diving in just to answer questions and build a report, but you're getting to the point where you really understand what's going on in the data. And at some point, you get that far enough along that it's time to present. So you take it to your stakeholders and you show them what happened. And it goes really, really well. So, your team is out of their minds. They're really happy. Their faces look terrible when they're blown up because it's ChatGPT. But it lands, it works. The sales and marketing team is on board. The handoff to engineering is really smooth. It works. So I'm going to open up a poll on the side. Who's had this experience? Just a time where you built a thing with data and it worked and you could feel it. Okay, rewind. You're on a data team. You're building a thing. You're figuring stuff out. Time comes to present it to the rest of the organization. And this time, it doesn't land so well. So you're giving the presentation and you can just tell that it's not resonating with people. And you go back to your desk and you feel like your work is not appreciated. And it's just kind of really hard to get this organization to come along. And over in the corner, Mark Andreessen is freaking out because of course he is. Who's had this experience? We built a data thing, or reached some conclusions with data, and it just didn't resonate. People used it for the wrong reason, or just ignored it, or it sparked a really long debate that seemed like it never came to an end. And so you weren't able to bring the organization along. So opened up a poll. Who's had this experience? Okay, I'm filming this in advance, so I don't know what everybody's going to say. But I actually did a survey of data scientists, data engineers, and data analysts before this. And here's what they said. Almost 40% of people said that important conclusions from their data analysis were sometimes ignored. Almost half of people said that they'd felt pressure to exclude or downplay data that contradicted the preferred narrative. And over 3/4 said, my organization sometimes uses data as window dressing to support decisions that were made in advance. So this kind of frustration with not being able to land the story for data, that's really, really common. And actually, kind of a kicker here, if you ask people in our sorts of roles, is effective data storytelling an important part of your job? Almost 90% of people say yes, it's an important part of the job. So that's what this presentation is about. I want to talk about the work, and especially the long-term work, the things that you can do ahead, the things that you can do after, not just in the presentation, but kind of the whole supply chain for that. How do you build up to effective data storytelling across an organization? For me, the key to that is persuasion. So I don't think it's fair to say that you just present the data and you think that you hope that it's going to speak for itself. You're talking to specific people in specific places who have specific concerns and emotions and motives and all of those things. There's a lot going on. The data you're presenting is, unless you do the work, probably not the most important thing they're going to run into that day. So you need to be persuasive if you're going to really land the message with people. And I'm getting geeky here, but persuasion is a joint function of the data and the audience. So don't turn your back on the audience. If you unpack it a little bit further, and I'm going to go into some of the theory of formal logic for a few minutes and then get really practical. But if you unpack the theory a little further, persuasion is a joint function of data and assumptions depend on your audience. So let's talk a little bit about the assumptions that you're making through data. Okay, next poll. Who is familiar with the difference in formal logic between inductive arguments and deductive arguments? And it's not fair to look at this slide and say you're familiar. Like who's aware of this before? And I'm genuinely curious on this because I ran into these concepts in applied math and debate, actually. They weren't part of my statistical training. So I'm curious if this is part of other people's background here. So inductive arguments, the kind of the classic definition is you use specific observations to form a general conclusion. And deductive arguments are kind of the inverse of that, use a general premise to form specific conclusions. And if you're like me, this definition is like nice and tidy, and it's got this, it's parallel but reversed, and kind of useless. Like this never made sense to me until I had some examples. So let's do some examples. Here's an inductive argument. After careful observation, we haven't seen any hummingbirds all day in this forest. Therefore, we conclude there probably aren't any hummingbirds in this forest. That's an inductive argument. You're going from these specific observations, minute by minute, no hummingbirds, and arriving at the general conclusion that I guess this forest just doesn't have hummingbirds. Here's a deductive argument, and similar but turned around. Dolphins are mammals. All mammals nurse their young. Therefore, dolphins must also nurse their young. So a little bit of a different flavor, kind of Sherlock Holmesy, right? If you put those things next to each other, again, inductive is based on observations of specific cases. Your conclusion is more general than the specific cases. And one of the interesting properties and unfortunate properties of inductive arguments is, at best, it's probably true. You actually can never completely guarantee that you're right. All you can do is you say, hey, I found a pattern. This seems to be a pretty common pattern. I think this pattern might be true a lot. It's probably true. Deductive arguments, on the other hand, you start with these very crisp, clear assumptions or general principles, and you build those up in a strictly logical way. And at the end of the day, if you built a valid deductive argument and all the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. And that property of deductive arguments makes them really powerful for bringing an organization along with you. The way I like to think of it is, when you make a valid deductive argument, it always moves the conversation forward. And by the conversation, I mean the collective, what everybody's thinking about. It moves you forward. And there are two ways that can happen. One is your audience says, well, your logic is valid, and I agree with all of your assumptions. And you say, well, great. As a logical person, you got to agree with the conclusion too. We're on the happy path, right? Everybody's persuaded. But even if that doesn't happen, you can still wind up in a good place. So if your audience says, well, your logic is valid, but I disagree with some of your assumptions, you're not yet celebrating that everybody's got the same conclusions, but there's some very clear paths forward here. You can say, well, okay, like which specific assumptions do you disagree with? Okay, you don't agree with assumption A. What do you believe instead? Like what seems reasonable to you? And then last, what evidence would be enough to change that assumption? And maybe that's changed the other person's assumption. Maybe it's changed your assumption. Maybe it's something you don't know yet. So the thing that all of these have in common is whether or not you get to that happy outcome in one jump or not, every single one of those paths forward helps you align assumptions with your audience. It gives you a clear next step for honing the argument and making it better. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to agree with your original conclusion at the end of it, but it means that for each rev of this kind of conversation, you're getting closer to full agreement on how the world works, whether that's them changing or you changing or whatever. Just to go back, the same is not true of inductive arguments. So, that probably aren't any hummingbirds in the forest. That's killer, because what it means is the person you're talking to can say, okay, I see all your data, I see all your evidence, I get the point that you're making. I still disagree. I just don't buy it. And there's really no direct path forward from there. Now, you can try and turn it into a deductive argument and then use those other tactics. But as long as it's an inductive argument, showing all the evidence and building the argument doesn't force anybody else to agree. Doesn't necessarily move the conversation forward. So sad phase. One last point to make on this, and then I'll get out of the theory and make it more practical, is statistics are really cool because they let you make deductive arguments based on data, right? One of the strengths of inductive arguments is you get to build up from observation. Statistics does that too, but it wraps it in a way where you get to actually make a formal deductive argument. So here's an example, and this is kind of the classic example from political polling. 60% of voters polled said that they'd vote for candidate A. The assumption here is we're doing a political poll and trying to figure out who's likely to win. So 60% of voters polled said they'd vote for candidate A. The poll had a sample size of 1,000. The poll was a representative survey of all voters, so we can extrapolate from our sample to the population in general. Therefore, if the election were held today, there's a 95% chance, and greater than 95, I didn't do the statistical power calculation, but there's a very high chance that candidate A would win. Deductively valid argument, solid. Now, if you wanted to make a different argument, like, therefore candidate A will win, now you've got to introduce some new assumptions, right? Like, not just, well, and the assumptions would be things like, how likely are voters to change their minds based on what they said today? If you wanted to, you could poke holes in this a little bit and say, well, maybe people say different things in polls than they do in the actual elections. But either way, you have an avenue to pursue there. You can ask those questions and dig in further. So again, I don't know everybody in the audience here, but I would assume that most of us have at least some exposure to statistics, and some of us have a lot of it. And it gives us the superpower where you can actually reason from data, but build these kinds of deductively valid arguments that help move the conversation forward, help build alignment in a whole organization. And I actually think that's one of our key jobs as data people, to help move the conversation around what's knowable and how we know it in an organization forward. Okay, that's maybe a little bit theoretical, but I hope will be good grounding for what comes next. I want to talk about keeping it simple. So this is, keep it simple, stupid. I'm definitely not the first person to say this. But when one of the weaknesses of the kinds of arguments that I'm talking about is they're brittle, they can easily become a house of cards, because if one assumption or one link in your chain of logic is off, then the whole conclusion will fall apart in a deductive argument. So you can draw these out, and it's like so many other things, you can draw it as a DAG, and I love that it's a DAG. Because of that, it's really, really, really important to kind of keep the supply chain simple, because if any one of the things supporting your conclusion doesn't hold together, then people aren't necessarily going to agree with you at the end of the argument. So some of those things are kind of purely logical concerns. They're figuring out, how do you make the simplest argument in terms of no unnecessary assumptions, or pick data that's really representative and that doesn't require leaps of logic. Some of this is emotional, and just kind of making it feel simple for your audience. So picking the right presentation format, not getting too wordy, not having lots of extra stuff in your slides, but making your argument really clear and concise. Choosing the right types of charts and graphs, eliminating chart junk, and so on. And I've put all of these as just sort of like a laundry list, because if you Google for data storytelling skills, or learn data storytelling, these are the kinds of things that'll pop up. The thing I'm trying to do here, and because there's so many other good sources, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that. I do want to spend time on one thing that I have seen lots of people get hung up on, and where I think there's some very specific playbooks that can work for us. That's not getting bogged down in methods. And then I'll go to the long term. So not getting bogged down in methods. All right, so let's think about linear regression as an example. Imagine that you have just done a project where using a linear regression is one of the important methods that you're using. And in the course of your presentation, somebody asks, well, what's this linear regression thing? Like, is that the right method? Should we trust that? You've kind of got two options there. One option is you can trot out all of your knowledge of statistics, and you can say, well, as I learned in grad school, linear regression depends on these assumptions. Like the functional form must be linear, and the errors must be IID, and must not be homoscedastic. ... And if you do that, you are almost guaranteed to lose your audience, because essentially what you're doing is you're saying, this house of cards that I've built, that my whole argument rests on, includes these 8 things that have really intimidating names that you don't even begin to understand as a non-statistician. And so good luck with that, right? Like asking somebody else to parse the validity of this argument is just kind of not a fair ask, because you have a whole bunch of statistical training that they don't have. It's really hard for them to have confidence in something like this. On the other hand, you could say something like this. You could say, well, regression, it's a statistical technique that's used to understand relationships among different variables. And it's one of the most widely used methods for forecasting and scoring and so on. Now, you should know, just, because they'll take away my stats license otherwise, you should know that there are a bunch of technical assumptions that need to be valid in order to use regression effectively. And I'm not showing you all of this in this presentation, but my team and I have done a really good job of running through these. We're confident in the results. So if you have questions about the technical stuff, happy to talk about that. But for this purposes of this conversation, I think what you need to know is regression is a common tool, and we've done our homework to make sure we're using the tool right in this case. So don't make it a stats class. That's basically what I'm advising. And essentially what you're doing there is you're changing the argument that you're making to other people. You are taking responsibility for your methods there. So the other person isn't thinking like, okay, well, they used regression and regression is appropriate here because the data is not homoscedastic. What the other person should be thinking is, we've got a good, competent team doing our stats. They've done their homework on this one. They say they're confident. And I've seen them do this kind of work in the past. So based on that, I have confidence in the team. They stand behind the method. Okay, I'll trust the method. So often, and I think this is because just the way that we're trained as data people, like we're kind of trained to get into the statistical arguments. So often that's the path we go down, and it's not the one that's helpful for the people that we're working with. It's not the one that builds trust or confidence for them. And it's also not the one that is persuasive. All right, let me now switch over to the long term. And what I want to do is I want to talk about making time to grow shared assumptions. And I'm choosing the word grow deliberately because at least my experience is this is a very organic process that takes time. One of the harder experiences that I've had as a data guy is being pulled in to give a presentation to the exec team and, an exec team. I've actually had this experience in multiple places and multiple times. And it's one thing if you know the people on that team and you're talking to them and you kind of know where they're coming from. Very different experience if you're presenting blind and you have no idea where to start from. One of the pieces of advice I would give to basically every data team is you need some way to grow to grow a foundation of shared assumptions together. In that poll that I talked about, we asked people who are your primary audiences for data storytelling. And these are the results. We don't need to go through them in detail, but just looking at it, one of the main things you'll see is these are very different types of teams. Like different people, execs are going to respond in a different way than sales and marketing teams, are going to have a different set of concerns than engineering teams. And so understanding who you're working with matters a lot. Here's my proposed recipe for growing shared assumptions. One, pick a stakeholder group that you need to work closely with. Two, schedule a recurring meeting with them. And there's this whole, I hate meetings as much as the next guy, but I think this kind is really valuable. And so I think it's a little bit of an exception to the rule of don't do a standing meeting unless you know what you're going to do. Or maybe one way to say it is, I know exactly what you're going to do. It's just going to vary week to week. So do it. So the goal of that meeting is you're going to workshop ideas together. You're going to bring data. You're going to bring preliminary results. They're going to bring questions or ideas or just what they're dealing with around the organization, and you're going to talk about it together. And the goal is to work out issues and figure things out together there. Point 4 is really important one. If you don't have something important to present, or it's something that's new or would move the conversation forward, cancel the meeting and be quick about canceling the meeting. Because what you want to do is you want for your stakeholders to know that every time you meet with them, there's going to be something new and interesting. Some of that's just good psychology, right? Like they're going to be curious what you've got next. And some of it's not wasting your time. And then last but not least, after the meeting, share a summary of the important points, both with the stakeholder, and some of that is writing it down so that you're building a shared foundation over time. And some of it is sharing it back with your team or other people who might not have been in the room, but will need to understand what's going on there. Because our goal is to build a pool of shared assumptions. There are a few different permutations on this. If you are like an analyst fully embedded in a business unit, then that's really natural and easy to do. If you are a analytics team or maybe a data engineering team that has several different stakeholder groups, but you're not embedded in any one, you can still make this work. All I would say is you have to be deliberate about it because you won't be able to do this kind of full service for everybody. And so you should be really clear which of those relationships are most important to you. With execs, sometimes it's tricky to do this. At the very least, you can do the like pre-meeting meeting where you give preliminary results just to make sure you're on the right track. If you actually have a way where you can secure some kind of ongoing feedback, that's even better. But sometimes that's difficult. But what I would say is without this kind of foundation, it's going to be really hard as a team to make sure that you're staying on the happy path. Here's, again, I said I'd try and be very practical. Here's a template for the email you could send or, you know, the conversation you could have. So, hey, I'm excited to be working together on whatever it is you're working together. And in my experience, the way, in order for this collaboration to really work, it's going to be important for us to stay on the same page. So I'm going to set up a recurring call. For this one, I said every other week, kind of depends on how fast your team's moving, how much you got. But I'm going to set up a recurring call. And what I want to do there is I want to talk through my team's findings and just make sure that we're on the right track, make sure that the work we're doing is useful for you. And of course, we can always cancel if there's nothing important to tackle in a given week. It's pretty hard to say no to this kind of request. And especially if the person giving it is persistent about it. And it's really, really important because otherwise you're at high risk of walking into that high stakes meeting, presenting something and having it just fall flat. Okay, last thought here. This is a metaphor that came up as I was working on the project. Like I said, I working on this talk. Like I said, I started off with one title and switched in the middle. I switched in the middle because ChatGPT. So I was using ChatGPT for all the images. And one thing I noticed is I wanted to, in this middle square, you've got these people who are facing the data and not facing their audience. And I thought, oh, let's switch that around because that would, you know, just embody like really getting to know your audience. So I asked ChatGPT to do it and it didn't do it. And it didn't do it. And it didn't do it. And when I say didn't do it, like I kept asking, like, make the presenters face the audience. And ChatGPT thought it was doing it, kept saying, like, all the team members are clearly facing towards their audience. The team members are explicitly facing the audience. And as we know, you know, ChatGPT lies all the time. It just could not make a picture of data people who were presenting and facing their audience. And finally, I threw my hands up and I said, okay, whatever. It's the perfect metaphor. The, you know, giant bank of stock images that ChatGPT has been trained on, all of those have this this kind of trope of data people who face the data and don't face their audience. And that's exactly what I want to fight. So don't turn your back on your audience. Don't be ChatGPT here. Okay, quick recap. Data work feels better when you're on that happy path and when you're persuasive. Storytelling is just part of the job. Persuasion is a joint function of your data and your audience. So you can't trust the data to just speak for itself. That's not a thing. And given that, valid deductive arguments are the best way for moving the conversation forward, because in your deductive arguments, your conclusions will stack up and build up to bigger things. And even if people don't agree with all your assumptions, it's a really good way to help surface the misaligned assumptions and go there. As you're making these arguments, it's really important to keep it simple. And there are a lot of tactics out there. The one that I've focused on here is don't get bogged down in methods. Way too easy to do. Make time to grow shared assumptions, because that's the thing that will make the foundation for all of your storytelling work that much better. So it's kind of an iterative game, not just a one-time thing. All right, that's what I've got. I'm looking forward to chatting in the chat and talking with anybody afterwards. Oh, and before I forget, like I said at the very beginning, I'm one of the co-founders of Great Expectations, the world's leading open source tool for data quality. If you're interested in baking data quality and kind of shared assumptions into everything that you're doing, come talk to me, because we're building a thing that's very much in line with that, and I'm really excited about what we're building. Thanks. Talk to you soon.